Alright, how's it going? I know it took a little bit longer than I had anticipated to release this one, but here we are again with another tier list. This nightmare never ends. And thankfully this time my voice actually isn't, completely gone, but I do have a glass of milk to keep me company here, regardless. I did say that I might be planning to make a tier list video after the rebalance hits, and this is what it's going to be. What you're currently seeing is not the actual form of it. This is what the tanks were placed at in the previous tier list. What we're going to do to speed it up a little is that we're not just gonna place them all back in the board. We're just gonna go through each tank one by one from top to bottom and see if they deserve to be pulled up or pulled down. Another thing that I have also completely neglected to mention is that in the previous tier list there were quite a couple of tanks missing. If I recall correctly, one of them was the Vicus Light, which you see in its pre-balance form at a pretty low A tier. Many tanks will change at least a little bit, so again, as always, I do gotta make this pretty big disclaimer because last time it apparently didn't seem to get noticed at all for some weird reason anyway, at least with a couple of people, that this is strictly my opinion, this is strictly my take. This isn't like, oh, this is how these tanks are placed according to the Blitzstar Zeitgeist. No, this is literally all just my opinion, how it feels for me to play these tanks, and for me if they perform well in the current meta. So that is basically it. We're going to start right off the bat. I do have a couple of notes here, but they're very disorganized, so just in case, don't milk me or anything. Anyway, we're gonna start off with the bat chat, and I feel that a lot of people probably saw this one coming as a nerf, but overall, it doesn't hurt it. It's still a very high A, the bat chat is still a very competent light tank. It is just that it is not the best anymore, per se. Every other tier 10 light tank actually did get quite decent buffs overall, so seeing the bat chat get nerfed I think was really only fair. So again, this will be a high A tier, but it's still very much worth playing. Next up, the E5. The E5 remains in its spot, mainly because it did not get changed at all. There's literally no changes to the E5, so it's staying where it is. It's a very good, very consistent heavy tank, as is. Next up, the Yo. I think we all basically guessed that this was gonna happen, wasn't it? So, the Yo, I think everybody can agree with that the 2-shot 120 mil is quite fun, but in a platoon it gets really toxic. In general, 2-shot autoloaders are currently just a plague in Blitz. They're just, for me, easily the best autoloader format. However, Wargaming has decided that they'll nerf the hull armor, which, fair, it never really bounced that much anyway. They'll buff the mobility a tiny bit to compensate, but then they nerfed the aim time on not only the 120 mil, but also on the 105, which to me doesn't make that much sense. The 105 should have honestly just been kept as is, and the 120 should have gotten that nerf. However, you can still bypass a lot of that by using Radical Cal. It will still hurt, because the aim time nerf on the 120 is pretty sharp. But I am willing to still give it, like, a middle-of-the-road A tier. The Yo will still work, it's just that it's going to be a little more annoying in that term. Next up we have the 268, and the 268, I don't think I'm gonna surprise anybody, but it's staying in S tier. The actual changes that it has gotten were so inconsequential that it doesn't really do anything. Same goes for the 4202, it didn't really get any changes. The Powerhouse, the 113 GFT, honestly did get what it deserved, no more reactive armor, thank god, but overall, even with the changes, it is still a very robust TD. Literally the only actual weak part of the whole armor profile has to be the lower plate. It's staying as is. The PBR model is nice, but it's this thing is basically just a box, so it's kind of difficult to say, oh, it looks nice when it just looks like a trash can. Anyway, it's staying in S tier. The E100 is a little more complicated, because the 150 did get nerfs. Honestly, at this point I would say that the 150 is actually not worth running, because the 128 got such an impressive buff that you should run the E100 with the 128, probably running with the calibrated shells too. The damage output is genuinely a little bit astounding on it. There's always the, problematic mobility, because, it weighs like 130 tons, the bizarre turret armor profile, so sometimes tanks will just pen you anyway. But really, all things said and done, if we're talking about the 128, I think this can stay as a very low S tier or a very high A tier. If it was with the 150, it's gonna be on the threshold to B tier, actually. So, as much as I like the E100, right now you should honestly play it with the 128. Anyway, that's the S tier for now. We might come back to it, but what we really gotta do now is talk about the 1321. So the 1321 is really interesting in that I will place my very biased opinion right now and say that it's currently my favorite tier 10 light tank. So I don't think the S tier is going to surprise anybody. It moves great, it has the adaptive camo, it's very fast, and it still has a quite respectable damage output. Honestly, getting the gear oil is a little bit bizarre, because one of your provision slots will immediately just be taken up by the protective kit, because Chinese tier 10s apparently just don't have module health. And it will also be taken by a big rations, because come on, you really should use those. So it's only leaving your third slot to either improved fuel or gear oil. And while the gear oil does help with the reverse a lot, I'm not sure it's really that necessary. It's still gonna move fine. So for me, it's an S tier, but really it should have gotten a better module health instead of the gear oil. Excuse me, I didn't say I was entirely 100% healthy. Anyway, next up we have the 50M. I bet that this isn't gonna surprise anybody, it's going into S tier. So, the E50M has gotten... I'm just gonna say it's gotten over-adjusted. If it only got the side armor changes, I would have still said, like, fine, but it still would be very strong. Even in its previous state, it was a strong medium tank. Yet here we are, and in its current state, if you run it with somebody competent in a platoon, you are a death squad. So, immediate S tier. I don't think I really need to explain myself. The Leopard was a little confusing. I don't really quite remember what changes are actually sticking on it, but it looked like it was going to just be completely shot dead. Thankfully, that hasn't happened. I need to play it more in the upcoming few days, but as it is right now, I haven't really noticed anybody from the clan or anybody from my friends saying that it like feels worse or that it's like struggling more. So I'd say that it's still going to be in a high A tier, but it's really gonna depend on the player, because it's still a very high skill ceiling tank and I just play like garbage in it. Next up, the VK72. And for me, the VK72 was for a really long time just a kind of misunderstood tank. I hated it. With the PBR change, and I think what it got was like a reload nerf, not a small one either, I'll honestly say that it's still high A tier. I've played it for like 25 battles yesterday, and it was a bucket load of fun. I'm just gonna be real with you here. I'm gonna braid the K-Fob, just really fun to play. With the tungsten, with adrenaline and a multi-kit, what you're essentially doing is that you're sacrificing a chance to fix your engine if somebody keeps firing into your lower plate, which can happen and it is really annoying. But for me, that tungsten, that adrenaline is really hard to give up. As it is right now, the VK72 is in a very comfy position. The PBR model is weird in that the side bulges of the turret area aren't as visible anymore, I would say, but the turret cheeks are now a little bit weaker, to the point that they can actually be a weak spot, which is a little bit strange, but we'll keep it. A little bit of milk. There we go. Anyway, Next up, we're going to talk about the T100. And for me, the T100 now is also an S tier. I'm going to be honest. The T100, honestly, as it is right now, is in a very good spot. It got basically all of the stuff that it needed balanced, a little bit touched up. So now it performs basically almost nearly as close as it did on release, which if you remember when it released, that was it was a plague, it was a swarm of locusts. But yeah, basically the T100 I would say is also, combined with 1321, a really fun light tank to play. It's still pretty misunderstood on my end and I play it badly because I'm not good with light tanks, but still that's beside the point. What's not beside the point is the STB, and this one was really complicated for me. Because the nerfs that it received were actually kind of pretty big, pretty extensive, shall we say. I think that Wargaming has absolutely overdone the nerf, because the mobility changes really just shouldn't have happened. This wasn't really a fast medium tank in the first place. It got up to speed, but it took a while. There's just always a fast medium tank somewhere. The reload nerf is also a bit harsh, but the tank still shockingly performs really fine, the same as it did before, so if anything, the shell speed nerf was probably the most pointless change, which we're gonna get to the shell speed nerfs later, but oh boy, I'm not happy about those. So, as it is right now, it's a guilty pleasure for me. The STB has to stay at its tier. The 60 TP basically got no changes, it's staying there, still a good heavy tank, you should probably give it a try. The Vicus is going to be a little bit complicated. For me, before this, it was a mid to high A tier. Granted, it losing its 350 alpha was absolutely not a great move on Wargaming's part, because I feel that the 350 alpha was what made it a little bit more unique. Actually, you know, giving it just a little bit more reliable gun. So what Wargaming has decided with this and the Chieftain, which I think is an incredibly baffling change, is to swap the Pramo for the Hesh. So I might as well, you know, just talk my heart out on this. So when the Vicus properly came out, it packed a good gun in a mobile chassis. Wargaming decided that having consistent alpha was apparently cringe and lowered it to the level of the T100, and that was that. Until they also decided to replace the regular gun with the Hesh gun, basically forcing you to 259 AP pen and 194 Hesh with calibrated. And as if that wasn't enough of a gut punch, the Hesh deals 350 alpha, so your desired alpha is back, but in the worst way possible. Hesh works on the 183 for obvious reasons. I'm gonna break the kayfabe here again. It works on the 4202 because it has a way higher alpha and actually requires some skill to use. The Vicus Light requires the skill of a 4202 player to really deal damage that most of the mediums can deal with their standard ammo. The Hesh pen is simply actually just annoying from my experience, and the pen on the AP, even with calibrated, just means your battles will probably be pretty frustrating. The reload is great, don't get me wrong, and the accuracy is still quite good, but for me, playing the Vicus in its current state is just an exercise in frustration. It would have made way more sense if the guns on this and the Chieftain were separate, optional. Because I feel that 350 Hesh as a value just doesn't work. It really doesn't. It would have made more sense if it was 350 AP and then 400 Hesh. That would have worked, that would have been better. But 350 basically means that not only is it gonna be a little inconsistent, but why would you really try to pull this off? Like, at this point I would just suggest to people to play the bad chat or the 1321 instead. I know some people really like the Vicus in its current state, I just don't really like it, so it's gonna be a low B tier. Next up we have the IS-7. The IS-7 also got some changes. I think the lower plate nerf was deserved. Like, don't get me wrong, that lower plate was always the plague. Even now it's still like trollish enough to get a couple bounces every now and then, but got another mobility nerf. I don't know why. because that was really like one of the main gimmicks, is that it didn't turn great, but it sure got up to speed. And as it is right now, it's gonna be in like middle of the road B tier. It's still absolutely playable, so, you know, don't get me wrong on that, but, you know, it's just kind of, it's a little bit rough for some of the heavies right now. Anyway, mid B tier, and now we're getting to the 140. Wow, what a surprise. For me, the 140 just got the Freeton Alpha back, and that was really all that it ever needed. The additional changes, I can understand, sure, whatever. That was really all the 140 needed. In its current state, I think what it's basically being hailed at is like a fast medium, which, sure, it gets pretty fast. But overall, it did really need that Freeton Alpha to perform better, so I'm glad that it got that back. So, low S tier, unbiased, clearly. Next up, we have the 121B. And, oh boy, I'm gonna get back to my notes on this. It's gonna be a high A tier. I contemplated putting it in S tier, but the armor change is not as big as I made it out to be before. It did impact the survivability a lot, though. You can also brawl better, you move a little bit better, and you also have a little bit more HP. Overall, these are all the changes that the 121B kind of needed, and I appreciated them as a result. So, high A tier, shall we say. The Sheridan did get that alpha buff. It's kind of minuscule, though. I'd say that it's still a relatively good light tank, but it's gonna remain at a high B tier / low A tier for me. I don't really enjoy playing it. Next up we have the E4. Probably one of the more baffling changes. If I recall correctly, they handed it sandbag armor, which, if you know how to play the E4, you understand why that is kind of wrong. The E4 never really had a problem with hit points or survivability in general. It was just kind of a weird gun platform with like a kind of, sort of, not really turret mounted on it. As it is, it's gonna stay in B tier, but I need more time with it. Same goes with the T57, the changes that it got were not nearly significant enough, and the same goes for the 215B. The 263, I'm very conflicted on, because they finally gave it back its AP, and I feel that that was probably the biggest thing that it needed, because APCR as main ammo for me is just, I hate it. I hate it, simply due to the angle normalization memes and all of that. However, that wasn't all they did to it, was it? No, they gave it one more degree on the left and right for the gun, which I don't understand why, but sure, alright, keep your secrets. But the Traverse nerf, I think it did receive a Traverse nerf, at least, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's not really good for a tank that already had problems with it, especially a tank that is so map dependent that when you suddenly get circled on a good map, it is just over. So I'm going to move it down to a lower B tier. It's still a guilty pleasure for me. That gun sings, that gun has great output. But as it is right now, it is not a fun tank to play, especially in the current meta and especially on most of the current maps. When you're on Himmelsdorf, the 263 performs great, but like most other maps, it's a nightmare. It's just like, no, don't bother. The M60 is weird. I got it recently, so it's actually being placed here. I don't know why they decided, hey, what does this thing need to, like, differentiate itself from the M4D8? Like, you couldn't just keep the 350 Alpha. No, they go, oh, it needs sandbags. No. So, if you replace most of your provisions with sandbags, what you're doing is that you now have a kind of sort of slower M4D8 with like 2100 hit points, which is funny. It is funny, don't get me wrong, but I did not enjoy playing it that way. I just felt that it kind of gave you room for one more mistake, and that's about it. It didn't feel nearly impressive enough. So for me, the M60 and the M48 are staying in B tier. The M48 getting like additional consumables, absolutely pointless, by the way. The like reactive armor shouldn't even be in the game, but woe is me, they're putting it on more tanks. So I'm a little bit angry about that, but oh boy, the 1-2-1. Those that know me know that I am very biased towards Chinese mediums. I like the gimmick of them a lot, but excuse me, I had a bit of a family moment there. But basically, those that know me know that I am very biased towards them and that the gimmick for me is fun. So seeing the 1-2-1 kind of nerfed and then Wargaming going, oh no, but it's going to get reactive armor. Why? Why? The reactive armor on a lot of these tanks simply does not make sense. You need that additional slot, especially on a tier 10 Chinese tank, to be an additional repair kit, or, god forbid, tungsten on the 1-2-1. So the reload nerf I'm not sure was actually warranted, because the 1-2-1 already struggles to deal out damage consistently. The minor power to weight buff is nice, and the turret to burst nerf overall doesn't impact it, but it is going to go down a tier, I'm sorry to say. As it is right now, I wouldn't say the 1-2-1 is worth playing in the current meta. It's still going to be an interesting gimmick tank, but I would play the lower tier variants instead, so you'll have to roll with the punches a little bit. Next up, we have the Progetto. Oh boy. Oh boy. I feel really bad for the Progetto. It got shafted. So basically, the really important thing is that gun depression nerf. And for me, gun depression is like this. Don't nerf it. It's gun depression in a lot of these tanks makes the tank what it actually is. The Progetto 65 performs better because it can perform on a more terrain. The fact that you remove that 1 degree from it and the Caro means that it's gonna perform worse. C tier, that is legitimately all I need to say about that. It is a genuinely terrible change. The Caro, I think, kind of needed adjustments, but I feel that Wargaming had a little bit too much of a heavy hand with the Caro, so if you had the Caro placed on your tier list, I think that you should place it a tier over. Anyway, the Hori. The Hori is interesting because I still don't really play it much. However, it does deserve to be placed a tier higher now, because the balance changes really only benefit it. The shell velocity buff, very nice. I did actually run supercharge for a while on the Hori just because of the velocity. Now I don't need to. Now I actually run the gun lane drive. And overall, the reload time is also very solid now, so the overall over alpha compared to most other TDs actually makes sense. So, whoop-de-doo. The mild attractiveness nerf is a bit annoying, but it's not really noticeable, and same goes for the soft stat nerf. I didn't notice the gun performing worse as a result. The Type 71, I think, is going to stay in the same tier. And the reason is simple, it got the ammo basically adjusted. The Pramo Alpha buff was to be expected, that's the Japanese gimmick. Overall, the minor pen buff is whatever, but the reload nerf still hurts a little. Overall, I'm not really a fan of the tank regardless, but it is staying in B tier for me. The Act Panzer, oh boy. Oh boy. If you ask me and a couple of other friends that I have, I just gotta say that the Act Panzer didn't need this change. Honestly, them buffing the cheeks and then just worsening the overall damage output like that was, I think, unnecessary. I had to play the Act Panzer a little bit for this, and I thought at first, like, oh, maybe the cheek buff will actually help, because it's like, what, 10mm and it's angled, that's not that bad. And then I play it, and I realize it didn't make a difference in the survivability, but I dealt way less damage. Simply just because of that reload nerf. At least I think that the receiver reload nerf, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but it just performs worse now. It was quote-unquote relatively balanced in its previous state, and now I'm genuinely just gonna say it's not worth playing. So that's basically it. Then we have the 50B. The 50B is staying in B tier. The changes that it got, insignificant. The Kranvan, however, oh boy, this has to be a low A tier now. It is still, don't get me wrong, boring as sin. I don't like playing the Kranvan because my eyes start to glaze over. However, that gun actually now has a decent damage output. It is genuinely surprising. To me, the biggest change that it really got and that really benefited it was that interclip buff. Because it really did help a lot with getting the damage out, and the tank now also encourages you to really only use the first shot, as it's now like nearly 3 seconds shorter than the second. I think it's like 6.56 versus 9.3-ish. Also, you know, 4th alpha and all that, but essentially, that means that the Kranvan is now a decent single-shot dealer, and for me, the other 2 shots are basically a reserve clip I tap into when I really need to clear something. So the Kranvan now actually has some interesting dynamics at play, which is not something I ever expected to say, I'm gonna be honest. Next up we have the T62. I don't think this is gonna surprise anybody, it's going down a tier. The shell speed nerfs, if I recall correctly, were basically justified as, oh, we want people to like move in into like a closer distance and actually use the mediums to like, you know, brawl at a closer range where the shell speed doesn't matter that much. And I understand the reasoning, however, the biggest issue is always with that one person that camps at the back. And this person is gonna notice the shell speed nerf, and they're gonna go, oh, but I'll just still camp at the back, I'll just pre-aim more. Or they'll just go, oh, I'll just install supercharge. It doesn't actually counter the actual issue. You need to motivate players to actually move in and start brawling. If they're gonna still stay at the back, the change was completely pointless. So, as it is, the 62A basically got shot in the foot for arguably no particular reason. Oh boy, next up we're going into C tier, and this is where we see some pretty decent changes, honestly. So, the 183, I was about to move the Vzor, but the 183, it's staying in C tier. Because for me, the 183 is just kind of middle of the road, because, you know, haha, funny, big damage. The nerfs I actually was a little bit surprised by, but honestly, it's still gonna play the same, so to me they don't really matter that much. What I think got absolutely hilariously overbuffed was the Vzor. Like, easily S tier. Like, not even a low S tier, this is a high S tier. So, the thing is, on the Vzor, the thing that makes the 2-shot autoloader perform in such a more toxic way than on the Yo is simple, and that is the combat stabs. Because this is just kind of like a peeking tank. You peek out, you just like boom, and you move out. Now you have 2 shots, and they deal 460 alpha. So you have a very similar output to the Yo, but you just perform just better at it, and you have a better armor profile, even though I hate the armor on the Vzor. I feel that this was absolutely hilariously overbuffed. The changes me and a couple of the real fellas suggested were to not bother with the 2-shot autoloader and just make the tank lighter. Make the tank lighter, slightly more accurate perhaps, and it could have had an interesting gimmick, because as it is, the Vzor 55 is just way too heavy. It's so heavy. If it was like 5 or 10 tons lighter, the effective horsepower would climb up to a point where you could consider it to be an interesting mobile heavium. Kind of sort of heavium with an actual armor profile. But as it is right now, I would not be surprised if they nerf it in the near future. Like, that is absolutely viable to happen. Thankfully, you don't see many of them, because the Czechoslovak heavy line genuinely isn't that appealing to begin with. Of all of those heavies, I really only enjoyed the tier 8. The tier 6 is a nightmare. The tier 7 is kind of okay, the tier 8, again as I mentioned, is the only one I enjoyed. The tier 9 is lacking, to say the least, and the tier 10 is just really overcooked now. So it's just that it's a niche line, is really the only thing that prevents it from being ridiculously dominant. I wouldn't be surprised if this thing appears more in competitive now, alongside the VK72 60TB and, again, the Kranvan. Surprising comeback. But oh boy, I'm not happy about the change. It makes it very effective, don't get me wrong, but it needed other changes. Next up we have the Foch 155. And the Foch is really interesting, because for me it always kind of struggled, but now it's a good TD. It's a good TD. So, it's got a new lease on life. The armor is just way more reliable, and the 2-shot gun now also has additional reasons to actually be used. The single shotgun now also has a reason to exist. It's still more consistent, but it's just, better. The thing that it really got shot in the foot about was just the mobility nerf. That one sucks real bad, but thankfully it still moves really, really okay. Oh boy. Thankfully we're nearing the end of the list soon, so we have the grill. And the grill I am tentatively moving up a tier. Because the grill did deserve some additional buffs, and it did get the reload buff, and that's nice and all. But in general, this is still a tank destroyer I'm not going to play, because if I want that kind of gun and I want it in an interesting gimmick, I will play the Ho-Ri, because the Ho-Ri has the actual pen and an overall lower alpha loss, so it's kind of, just hard to play the grill still nowadays. I think it got gear oil, and again, I don't really think that it needed that, because it moves pretty well as is, so low B tier. The IS-4, I felt that it absolutely, did not deserve those armor nerfs, even if it was a pretty dominant heavy. With those armor nerfs, they started leaning it more towards a mobile heavy type of play, but the thing is they kept the garbage soft stats on movement and the overall effective horsepower, so I'm glad that it's all changing, but the armor buffs basically mean that it's almost back to its prime. So, I'm gonna have to play it more, but so far from what I heard, the IS-4 just performs really well now, so I'm a little bit worried. The mouse basically got nothing changes for it, same goes for the 113, and we already discussed these three fellas, so now we are left with, oh boy, my bottom percentile. People know that I am biased towards these tanks, I genuinely don't enjoy playing them, so seeing that the TVP got the alpha buff back is good. However, I would still say that it's kind of over-nerfed. It's gonna be a very low C tier. It's gonna be a very low C tier. If you know how to play it, it is going to be fun, you're gonna dish out a lot of damage, but the additional reload nerf I feel was just unwarranted. Next up, the 4005. Does anything need to be said about the 4005, really? I was honestly genuinely tempted to bring it down a tier because the aim time nerf was pretty harsh, but it still actually just kind of works in some scenarios. It's just way more frustrating, especially without the reticle cal and all. E3, I'm gonna be honest, I have no desire to play the E3. I genuinely really don't. With these changes that I read, it just kind of feels like, oh, I guess they were just playing spin the bottle. So, genuinely, I can't tell you anything about the E3, so it's staying in D tier. And F tier, unsurprisingly, the Minotaur. Sinks on the forums had a very interesting suggestion regarding the Minotaur in terms of balancing. And by the forums, I mean the subreddit, my bad. And he basically suggested that this should be full-on a defensive tank destroyer, and to me that idea is really interesting and I feel that it could have worked. Thankfully Wargaming has backed down on the anti-clip booster on this, because it did not make any sense. But the fact that it still got that lower plate nerf and nothing else really in exchange is baffling. The reload buff Sure, okay. But what it really needed changing was that reserve shell reload, which is still just a little bit punishingly low, a little bit punitive, shall we say. So, as it is, for me, it is still my least favorite tier 10. And in the terms of didn't play, you know, the usual BZ, a bunch of the premiums and collectors, I didn't get to the Rinoceronte yet. The Murat, all I can tell you about the Murat is that I tested it. And that is all I can say. When I asked my brother about it, he said that the Murat is just like, you know, kind of fun. But overall, the line is ridiculously expensive. I would say that so far from what I am seeing in battles, the Murat looks really fun. So if you were on the fence about it, I would say you could probably give it a try. I'd say it's worth it. And then, from all of this, the CS63 got some pretty big buffs, so you might be interested in that one. Anyway, that's the shape of the tier list. I hope that it was at least a little bit shorter than, you know, the nearly hour-long video as last time. I think this is like 35 minutes. However, for me, this just kind of feels that, in a nutshell, light tanks mostly got buffs, a lot of mediums got shot in the foot for no reason, and heavies are basically kind of 50-50. Tank destroyers, a little bit iffy on. The example of the Foch 155 and the Ho-Ri is very good in terms of, like, you know, buffs and all. The 183 getting that nerf, the 405 getting that nerf, you know, a little bit sad. Yeah, Panzer, kind of same, really. However, I do feel that these changes are pushing again towards a more heavy-oriented meta, which was, I'm going to be honest, it was my least favorite meta in the whole game. I don't like prolonged battles where everybody just sits behind, like, just terrain and just goes like, oh, I'm gonna side scrape, oh, I'm gonna go hold down. It's boring, it's not dynamic or anything, and you gotta figure out a way to break that. So the fact that it's coming back in full force, and the Super Conqueror and M454 have reactive armor now, it's just gonna make competitive so much worse. I'm gonna be honest. My biggest complaint about it is that they always do this before the biggest tournament season, so I'm just gonna say I'm not gonna be surprised if we see way more Kranvans, S-Kongs, M454s, and all of that in the next tournament battles. Anyway, that's going to be it for me. I will try to put the tier list link down in the description so you can assemble your own, and, you know, you can tell me, like, your opinions on some of the tanks, you know, just, as always, you know, just keep it relatively civil at least, you know, don't call anybody names just because they placed a tank somewhere where you would have placed it higher. But that's gonna be it for me. Again, subjective opinion and all that. Let me know down in the comments, let me know how you would rate some of these tanks, because that's always interesting hearing some differing opinions on this matter. That's gonna be it for me. You know the usual, my name is Ab, feel free to like, comment, subscribe, check out the Discord, check out the Ko-Fi, and I'll see you all guys later, hopefully with another tier 10 review. So, bye bye.